All right, welcome to Unit 1, Video F. It's now a good time to tell you that I talked for 10 minutes without realizing my recorder was off. No? Shouldn't tell you that? Okay. All right. Let's talk about the Fair Labor Standard Act a little bit more. So I talked about minimum wage. What is minimum wage? And in what areas does minimum wage differ? And how does it work in things like service jobs, such as waiting tables? So the general rule is that employers don't have to pay certain positions minimum wage that are commission based or that they make up money in tips, and so they are required to fill in the gaps if somebody doesn't make their money in tips. So many of you have worked in those industries and should know those rules pretty well. But generally, minimum wage is like $7.25, and of course, that's just the floor. That many states have adopted higher minimum wage dollar amounts. So what I want to talk about next is a little bit about overtime. And so when we talk about overtime provisions, we're really looking at what defines an exempt employee. So arguably, that's where the guidelines start to get really complex, especially since the introduction of the Fair Play Rule. So think about it this way. A Fair Labor Standard Act, I don't think had been updated in a very, very long time. And so the exempt employee threshold was around $23,600. So meaning that anyone who made less than $23,600 and was a full-time employee was automatically eligible for overtime. A few exceptions in there. And so the Fair Play rules that came into play, no pun intended, under the Obama administration was proposed to be about $47,476. That's what they wanted to raise it as. Now you can see this from a variety of perspectives. One, with inflation, that rate should not have been $23,000. It should have been around upwards of $55,000 as far as setting the minimum bar for overtime. And so the Obama administration proposed a $47,000 minimum. Now that's a huge jump from $23,600. So if you can think about it from an employee perspective, that's really good. That's something that should have come down the pipeline long ago. But from an employer perspective, that's a huge jump. And so, of course, as with many things, the Trump administration came in and wanted to propose a lesser rise in that Fair Play Rule a dollar amount. And so their proposal was $35,568. So again, still significantly different from the $23,600. And I think no matter where you end up and whatever administration you end up with, any increase is going to be of value to the industry. There's definitely pros and cons to how much you should increase it over a certain amount of time. I definitely think a different rollout overall would have been better. More like a rollout over time probably would have been better. But, I don't know that our government is set up for a lot of different rollouts over time. So it's kind of like you do it with whatever dollar amount you can get in. So why in the world is that relevant to employee benefits? Well, a number of benefits actually are supported by how much you make. And so if someone is working more overtime or qualifies for overtime, that means there's more employer contribution to certain types of benefits, such as retirement plans and such. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. This is ERISA, and I'm going to go very high level since, again, this is going to be something that's covered in Employee Benefits 2 and 3 with Dr. Huff. So ERISA essentially deals with funding, vesting, and fiduciary duties. And I like to think of ERISA in like an analogy. When you're preparing a meal, like that's preparing a retirement plan, ERISA is like the health inspector. And then the fiduciaries are the ones who keep the kitchen clean, so to speak. So that's what I think about when I think about ERISA. So while the intent of ERISA was to deal with retirement plans specifically, there's an unintentional consequence of how it was worded, and then its complexity and broadness rolled over into impacting a lot of different employee benefit plans, including life insurance, disability income, and a whole bunch of others. So the biggest things to take away is that ERISA doesn't impact public sector or the nonprofit world so much. And its relevance to employee benefit practices that it impacts a number of different benefits. And ERISA is broken up into a variety of different titles that we won't necessarily go into, but each title has this particular area that it deals with. So it might deal with IRC provisions, it might address enforcement, whose job is it to enforce it. There's a particular provision that deals with the creation of a corporation, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, that is there to oversee some areas of ERISA. So again, the idea of ERISA was to apply to just pension plans or retirement plans, but it also has some implications in welfare plans, and it also intersects with COBRA and the ACA. And I'm going to skip over a couple of slides just to get to this Title IV section so I can talk a little bit about the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. That is it's a government corporation, so it's kind of a weird structure. But essentially, the role of this entity is to insure and guarantee private sector worker pension plans. So you have defined contribution and defined benefit plans. The PBGC oversees defined benefit plans, not defined contribution. So it's not funded by government funds, but rather by these defined benefit plans themselves. And so everybody kind of pays into it to this PBGC as part of ERISA. I think I looked at some data recently that said in December of 2019, the PBGC insured nearly 25,000 defined benefit plans, in which almost 35 million people took part. So they do play a very significant role in protecting defined benefit plans and employees' retirement benefits. So COBRA is a substantial amendment to ERISA, but that's not the real important point of COBRA for this class. The important point of COBRA is what it is and what it does. And so COBRA is essentially where an employee has a qualifying event that ends their employment with employer A. And that qualifying event, they are then able to retain their group benefits. They are required to pay the premium, but they would at least be able to be eligible to hold on to those benefits while they're transitioning jobs or while they're, looking for another job. And so COBRA applies to all private sector employers with 20 or more employees. So this is all really important information regarding COBRA. So you definitely want to know COBRA, particularly for your open enrollment presentation. So when we look at COBRA, there's a couple of things that we have to know. One, is this a qualified beneficiary, which is the individual that's covered by the group health plan? And then two, what's the qualifying event that is triggering their need for coverage? So there's certain events that would cause an individual to lose their coverage, such as their healthcare coverage. That can be the death of a covered employee. So say your spouse was working for company A or your partner was working for company A and your partner dies and you were covered under their policy. Well, you can't be covered under their policy anymore because they're no longer an employee, but we would allow you to participate in COBRA to continue those benefits. Termination or reduction in hours of employment. This also includes quitting, divorce or legal separation, again, for reasons that I mentioned when I talked about the death of the covered employee, or a dependent child becomes independent. So, they age out of the system, so to speak, or age out of the threshold of being covered under their parents' insurance, or a covered employee becomes eligible for Medicare. The idea of COBRA is to allow there to be a continuation of coverage, because before, when we were dealing with pre-existing conditions and gaps in coverages before the ACA, this allowed an employee to maintain those coverages and not have to deal with extra waiting periods. So its relevance to group health plans is you have a certain number of days to elect for it to kick in, but you, as the beneficiary, are responsible for paying the premium during the continuation of coverage. So you would be responsible for the 100% premium. So say, for example, it's $1,000 premium for your healthcare coverage. Well, your employer contributes to that healthcare coverage or to that healthcare premium. So say the employer is paying $600 a month of your $1,000. And technically and typically, you typically pay $400 a month. But now you're not working for the employer anymore. And so they're not going to pay that $600. So now you're going to be responsible for the full $1,000 premium, plus up to a 2% administrative cost. So you could be on the hook for 102%. Now, that could just be better than not having any insurance at all. You know, by now many of us have heard of HIPAA, especially if you visited a doctor's office in the last couple of years. But HIPAA has a couple of different provisions. First, employees must have access to their new employer's healthcare plan. That's a component of HIPAA. The second part is a little more of a moot point with the ACA, but it limits pre-existing conditions being used against you, or the exclusion of pre-existing conditions under a healthcare plan. But this is the part that most of us are familiar with. It protects the transfer, disclosure, and use of health information. And this is going to be an interesting component to talk about, particularly as we get to wellness programs and dealing with a lot of the wearables and genetic testing that's available for employees. Talk briefly about the Pension Protection Act of 2006. Again, this is probably something that Dr. Huff will get into a little more in his class, but essentially it strengthens an employee's rights under ERISA, which is why it's an amendment to ERISA. But its job is to protect pensions and penalize companies who underfund, basically hold those folks accountable for underfunding pension plans. And they do this through the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. All right, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, also known as Obamacare, also known as the ACA. And so essentially the goal of this act was to reduce the number of uninsured individuals. So Congress, I think, estimated costs to reach $971 billion through 2019. I believe that number exceeded that cost, and probably even more so recently with COVID-19. So individuals have to be covered by an employer or independently through the individual mandates. Companies with 50 or more employees must offer healthcare plans. And so I am going to ask you all to read an article that dealt with, they call it the Bermuda Triangle, where the ADAAA, the ACA, and another act really start to intersect, and where you see some of the challenges and where some of these laws start to conflict with each other, or really start to pose some challenges in addressing them. And I've already gone over several of these other acts. You see the ADA, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act is essentially an extension of Title VII just to individuals with pregnancy status. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 was enacted to remedy unequal women's pay. We started off at, I think, like 40 cents on the dollar, and I think we're up to about 80, maybe high 80s of cents per dollar that every man makes. And there's a lot of different research that counters what that data really means. Particularly looking at, I think, some working conditions. There was one guy who did some work looking at, pay differences between men and women, and really that it was kind of some gender assumptions about what type of work women were willing to do versus men. But I think during the time period that he did it, it might have been, more relevant. I've already gone over this information here, so I'm just going to jump around and go straight to this hypothetical. So Parker, Lewis and Craig LLC is a 500-person consulting firm located in Charlotte, North Carolina. Since pay raises are less than desired this year, the benefit coordinator wants to give the associate partners and partners a paid membership to a particular spa. According to the recent in-house survey, associate and full partners are more stressed than assistant partners who are entry-level employees. So I want you to think about what might be their legal exposure and statutory compliance issues if they were to offer this type of benefit to their associate and full-time partners. What information would you want to know about this? And we may come back to this one when we do our small group or our class discussion.